In this video, I wanted to talk about some of the core blocks on the SIM platform. So as you can see on the right here, we have our toolbar. So we have our triggers here on the top, and then we have all of the blocks here on the bottom. So the core blocks pertain to those blocks that are not integrations and are sort of very native to the SIM platform, and some of the first blocks that were created on the canvas. So amongst those blocks are, for the triggers specifically, the start block, the schedule trigger, as well as the webhook trigger. So these are a few of the core blocks that we can trigger a workflow with. Of course, there's many ways we can trigger a workflow with using the integrations, but in this case, we're going to kind of discuss the core blocks. So the start block is the most basic block on the canvas, but also one of the most powerful. So you can actually run the workflow using a start block. You can run it manually. You can run it on a chat. So for example, if you wanted to chat with the workflow, you can go ahead and add inputs to the start block to be able to capture the conversation ID and the user input. And you can even use the start block to call the workflow as an API. So there's a lot of different ways you can use this start block to trigger a workflow, and it kind of serves multiple purposes. So depending on how you want to trigger the workflow. Now, as mentioned before, we also have the schedule block, so you can configure a schedule to execute a workflow. You can have the frequency, and then you can select the time, as well as the webhook block as well. So if you had a custom webhook that you wanted to configure, you can go ahead and do that. And so every time you ping that webhook, the workflow will go ahead and trigger. So now moving on to the blocks. So some of these core blocks are located at the top. So everything from the agent block all the way down to the workflow block. We have multiple uses, and each one is powerful in their own way. So as you may or may not know, the agent block is one of the most powerful blocks on the canvas. It's essentially a wrapper for an LLM. So you can enter multiple user prompts here. You can select whether or not this is a system or a user or an assistant. So you can configure it that way. You can select your model. We host both OpenAI, Anthropic, and Gemini models. But if you're not using one of those models, you can actually bring your own key to use in the workflow. You can add memory. So if you wanted this agent to have conversation memory, you can give it a conversation memory here with the conversation ID. So I can simply pass in the start conversation ID like this. You can select a temperature. And finally, you can give it a response format. So if I wanted to say, user ID and email response format, I can simply use the wand to generate a JSON response format that's strict and that the agent adheres to. So this is super powerful to use in any kind of workflow, really. Now moving on, we have the API block. So this allows you to call any generic API with a friendly UI interface. So you can enter a URL, select the method, query params, headers, body, etc. Makes it super customizable. The condition block is a way in which to enter some sort of a Boolean statement, so either like a true or false statement. You can add, else ifs. You can just keep it simple and only have an if else. And so then you can actually use these handles here and route the workflow execution accordingly. The function block allows you to write custom code. So you can either write JavaScript code or Python code. You have the wand to generate that code, or you can write your code yourself. Additionally, we have the guardrails block. So here you can have some content, and you can either determine, okay, do I want the validation type to be valid JSON, regex match, hallucination check, or PII detection. So for example, we have all these different PII types, which is very powerful. If you have certain information that you do not want included in your workflow, you can add this guardrails block here. Moving on, we have the human in the loop block. So we can drag this one onto the canvas. So let's say you had some sort of a workflow execution that you wanted to pause and resume input upon a human approval. you can go ahead and configure the human in the loop block to do just that. So for example, you can enter the paused output, the notification type. So if you, for example, wanted to email, you can use a Gmail to send an email with that human in the loop URL to resume execution. And finally, you can enter a resume input schema here. Then in the toolbar, we can head back and look at the knowledge block. So now the knowledge block is a very powerful block to access a knowledge base. So if you haven't really looked into the knowledge base yet, there's a whole separate video on the knowledge base. But what's super cool about this block is you can have all sorts of different operations to search, upload, and create documents. You can select a knowledge base, you can enter a search query, number of results, and tag filters, which is super powerful. So I'd recommend checking that video out first. We have our loop block. So this allows you to, drag all sorts of different blocks into the loop like this. You can connect them. And then this will go ahead and loop over all of these blocks. You can select your loop type, for loop, for each, while, do while, which makes it super powerful if you have some sort of a looping logic that you want to implement. We have memory block. So if you want generic memory to be captured within your workflow, whether that be from an agent output or from some sort of a block output here, you can go ahead and capture that memory within the memory block and then give the rest of the workflow access to the memory using get memories or delete memories or even add memories as well. You can select a conversation ID, you can select a role, you can select a content. So this block is used for memory that's not directly stored within an agent per se, but for example, if you want to store it in other parts of the workflow, you can go ahead and do that using the memory block. We have a note block, so if you want to add notes to the canvas, you can go ahead and add notes using the note block. We have our parallel block. So our parallel block is similar to the loop block, but it actually executes all of the blocks in parallel that are within this node. So for example, if I had a bunch of different agents in this parallel node and I executed this workflow, all of these agents will execute in parallel. So if I wanted to define the number of times I want this to be executed in parallel, I can go ahead and I can select parallel count, and I can select the number of iterations, or I can select parallel each and define an array of items to execute these blocks in parallel. Additionally, we have the router block, which is also a very powerful tool on the canvas. So here you can actually give a prompt using natural language to direct the path of execution. So the path of execution can be, let's say for example, you have two agent blocks like this, agent 3 and agent 4. And so what you can do in the router block is you can give it some routing instructions. So you can say route to agent 3 if XYZ, route to agent 4 if ABC. So you can define some basic parameters and then route the path of execution accordingly. You can select a model to go ahead and do that routing for you. So that's pretty unique. Finally, we have a few more here. We have a variables block. So I've discussed the variables block in a separate video. So feel free to go ahead and check that one out. But it allows you to basically assign variables and dynamically change them in the workflow execution. We also have a wait block. So if you want to pause the workflow for a certain amount of time, you can go ahead and do that in the wait block. We have the workflow within a workflow block. So this makes it super powerful to select some sort of a child workflow and then execute that workflow within a main parent workflow. So as you can imagine, this can get super powerful when you have nested workflows that each do different tasks. Here you can execute a workflow within a workflow accordingly. And so that's pretty much it for all of the core blocks. Again, integration blocks are a case-by-case basis, so feel free to check out the other video for how to use integration blocks as well. Thanks so much.